But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss how leaders and their decisions shape the world we live in today.
Welcome to episode 2, part 2 of the History in Motion podcast. My name is Ritchie, and I'm here with our co-host Paul. Today's episode is a continuation of our discussion from episode 2, part 1, where we will dive deeper into the decision to drop the atom bombs and venture further into the domestic political landscape of Japan and what all-out war could have potentially looked like. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, so welcome everybody to part 2. So just to kind of quick recap from last week, we're at the point here where, the Japanese had surrendered to the Allies, really with the force of, the emperor making that final decision. And we kind of left off talking about we think it was the correct decision to do so. We knew Japan was going to be defeated, but there was so many unknowns in terms of how many more lives would have been lost. And so Richie, I'm going to just kind of bring up some of those estimates that we kind of touched on a little bit last week, but I got a few other things that I found since then. So the invasion of the southern region of Japan, the estimate was 350,000 U.S. casualties. So for context, I believe Okinawa was around 20,000. Yeah, 20,000 dead and about 50,000 wounded. So we're talking 4 or 5 times the scale of Okinawa, which was pretty much the bloodiest battle in the Pacific up to that point. And over 2 million military and civilian casualties on the Japanese side. So that's one piece. But then there was another really interesting piece that I saw. There's a historian who estimates that almost 400,000 civilians were dying every month in the war zones in the occupied areas in the Pacific. So you think of things like famine is a big thing. Food is just not getting to places. Economies are in ruins because maybe you're sending things to America, or you're sending things to India, or you're sending things to other parts of the Pacific. You're not sending your ships out during war. Not the brightest thing in the world to do. So there's so much loss, so much devastation. And there's also a war going on. We talk about the Americans kind of massing their troops along the outskirts of the Japanese mainland, but there's still different parts of Japan, of Asia that are occupied. There's a war still going on with the British in Burma. So there's all these people dying. So every month that the Americans delayed would have been another 400,000 people dying. So again, we talked about this terrible calculus of human life that needed to be played. But when you really look at this, almost as an arithmetic game, again, it kind of keeps coming back to me that this was a no-brainer for the Americans to do, dropping the bomb as quickly as humanly possible, to wrap this war up as quickly as they could.
Yeah, I think, again, I just even I always find myself when I hear these numbers and you have to decide, it's like that, what was that, the age-old dilemma, if you're in a subway train and you have to kill 5 people you don't know, or there's 5 people one way that you're going to kill, or 1 person the other way you're going to kill, but you have to pick a decision. You know what I mean? When I've been asked that question, my retort is always that you want to minimize the loss of life. And when we're having these discussions about total full frontal global war, the scale is just so massive, right? It's just so huge, the amount of loss of life that's happened at this point in time. It's been a long bloody war, and if I'm Truman, yeah, I think you gotta drop the bombs because you need it to come to an end. You can't, you just can't keep this going, because for what purpose, right? You're going to, and I'm sure you can't trust projections 100%. There's always that margin of error and miscalculation. But even if they're off by a little bit, those projections you were just telling me, 2 million people, that's crazy. That's so huge. And I
even if they're off by 50%, that's still a million people.
A million people.
Right?
It's nuts, right? The scale is so insane to me. So I think, yeah, I don't. At first, when we jumped into this topic, my initial gut reaction based on what I knew and what I thought I knew was that he shouldn't have dropped the bombs, to be honest.
Okay, interesting.
That's been my understanding for a long time. Wait it out. They're going to fail. You don't need to drop the bomb. But now knowing what we've kind of talked about, looking at the research, I think I've switched my mind.
Okay.
I no longer think that. I think it was a tough decision to make. I don't envy it, but I think it was the most prudent thing to do. And I think based on what we know about Truman and his history that was discussed earlier, he was a prudent guy, right? So
Right.
I think it was a prudent decision. And I don't want, again, like, I don't mean to uh, take weight out of the decision that he was making, because it was a huge decision. But given the numbers, given the projections, I think it was the best thing he could have done.
Yeah, I would agree with you too. I think I came into it with kind of always hearing that like it was this amazing, brave, incredible decision that Truman made. And I don't know if it, in my eyes, hurts his legacy slightly, kind of knowing everything that was going on and knowing what he knew. Obviously, again, it's still a very difficult decision because I think your analogy of the train is perfect, right? Like, do I go left and kill one person, or do I let it go and kill 30 people? The blood of tens of thousands of Japanese men, women, and children are on his hands when he makes a decision to drop that bomb. But 10 times as many are maybe not on his hand, but he does have the control to save a lot more lives.
Yeah.
And so again, I guess it is a classic. There's a reason that train example is so classic, right? It is the ultimate dilemma that very few leaders have ever had to make, and Truman being one of them. So at first I was like, yeah, maybe this hurts his legacy a little bit in my eyes, just because, it was such an easy decision. But like to know you have the blood on your hands, more directly, even than like, hey, we're going to do a bombing campaign. Okay, tell us what we're going to do. Okay, yeah, we're going to bomb Tokyo. Okay, great. You don't really have an idea of how that's going to go. You're more worried about your own soldiers losing their lives probably than anything else. But to drop a bomb like that, it's the classic like finger hovering over the red button to launch the weapon is really what it was. Probably was more of a phone call or signing off on some sort of document, but that's it. The blood is on his hands, and he has to own that for the rest of his life. And I think it's the right decision, but my goodness, to be able to put your stamp on that or write down and say, yeah, let's do it. It's something I definitely don't envy.
No, I don't either. And well, it's interesting because I was curious when I was doing my research, like, how did he feel about it afterwards, right? Like, after having made the decision, knowing the impact that it had, the legacy that it left, how did he come to terms with it? And based on what I read, based on some perspective of a few historians, he never once regretted the decision. Like
Wow.
it did not. He never second guessed himself. I think for him, the numbers were what he was looking at, and it really came down to that reality of. I think he was quoted for saying, like, "I saved the lives of a lot of young men on both sides," and that was kind of his rationale for it. That kind of goal of again minimizing the total loss of life that would have accumulated if he had not dropped the bombs. So I think again, it's that dilemma.
And I think it's an interesting point. It almost expands on that piece of duty that we were kind of talking about. Like, he had a duty to his soldiers during the First World War, a duty to his constituents as a senator, a duty to the country as vice president and a president. But I think he almost transcends that in a point that he had a duty, to the world, to limit the number of lives that were going to be lost for this essentially war that was in its final days, but just refused to kind of go away. And then to even see like what he did with the Marshall Plan and his thoughts kind of on communism and all that, which I think is a story for another day. But he definitely was a man who went from the duty of, again, something small and personal to the point of the whole world, and was kind of, he felt that he needed to make a difference. And I'm glad to hear that he never kind of went back on that decision, because I think with a lot of like revisionist history, right, like people saying like, oh no, we could have looked at this, we could have looked at that. But yeah, I think for his legacy, like, definitely needs to be given credit for making that decision. I don't think it was a hard decision when you look at it from a numbers perspective, but from an emotional perspective and a
Oh
am I
man.
doing the right thing? Am I changing the world? Like, and also too, like you have to think like this could spark the beginning of the atomic age. He didn't know
Went to the
what the world would have
Cold
come to,
War,
right?
yeah, and the
Yeah.
stockpiling of A bombs on both sides of the
Hmm.
of the East and the West.
Yeah. And so there's one thing too that I even found too, like if we kind of go into this, like I was trying to read some like what were the arguments against it. Um, and I think we already talked about like, Japan was defeated anyways. And we kind of talked about that. Like, yeah, they were definitely going to lose, but when and how
Yep.
was
Yep.
definitely up in the air. It could have been, a year, 6 months, 5 years, if there was change in leadership. Nobody really knows. Um, and then there was the piece of like the traditional invasion that like we already talked about those numbers being absolutely staggering. But one thing that I kind of was reading about, and I think is super interesting, is how far the Soviets would have got if the war was prolonged.
Mm.
And so we have to kind of roll back here to look at what Stalin was doing in Europe. So he's coming in from the east, moving through German occupied Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all of these countries. And he's kind of coming in saying like, yeah, I'm a liberator, but he's not a liberator. He's putting in puppet governments, or he's taking over control altogether. And there's the mass rapings that were going on as the
Yeah.
Soviets moved in, and it was quite horrendous what was going on. And so I think there was kind of this view of like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviets, they're going to help us defeat Germany. They're great. But then as things started to come around, Churchill was definitely in the mindset of, okay, the Russians are bad. He actually had something called, he put together something that never really went anywhere after the war. He called it Operation Unthinkable, where they were going to use like remnants of the German army to actually attack the Soviets and kind of
Oh,
push
no
them out
way.
of Eastern Europe. He was really concerned about Poland because I think that was how the war kind of started.
Yep.
Was Poland was invaded, and that's where they were kind of stuck between these two juggernauts and kind of got sliced apart. And I think he still had to worry for them. It's like they're not actually going to be free; they're going to have to live under communist rule. So there's this point on how much influence they're getting in the East, and we could see like the Cold War for all those years. The eastern part of Europe living under really terrible hardship under Soviet-backed communism. So if we look what happened in the East, so the Soviets really only had one big battle, and it was called Operation August Storm, which we kind of talked about last time, where the USSR took Manchuria, which is a part of northeastern China. And then they took Korea, and then it was split in half after the war between the Soviets and the Americans. And so if we just look at those two places, and remember, this is one big battle that the Soviets won. They wanted some area along the East Coast that they were able to get. There was a port that they wanted some access to. That was all agreed to prior to that invasion. But if we look at Manchuria and what kind of happened when China in the next 5 to 10 years was the Chinese Civil War happens, Mao's Communist Party takes over, and coincidentally enough, their main base of operations at the beginning was Manchuria because.
Yep.
It was owned by the Soviets. Stalin backed Mao. And so this one battle theoretically could have changed the course of Chinese history. And we also have North and South Korea, which we all see today as the North, being communist and the South being democratic, and the differences between those two countries. And so this just one battle could have potentially changed the course of the last 100 years of history, or last, I guess, 80 years of history with what's happening in China and Korea today. So it's just super interesting to see like, okay, this was one battle, but what if the war went on, another year, and the Americans were getting desperate and it couldn't get Japan to get defeated. And the Soviets were like, well, look, you gave us this land, but what are we going to do? Just sit here? Maybe there's a little bit more land in China we can take. What if we kind of move more south and we start looking into Southeast Asia or the Japanese mainland, altogether?
Yeah. That's a man, that it's interesting to think how the Russians could have played it, because from my time spent studying this particular point in history, looking at Russian history and how the Cold War kind of played out. Again, this is a point in time where everyone is worried about their footprint in the world, their hegemony, their empires, right? Like this is everyone wants to expand, everyone wants to have control over their lands, and you have these different schools of thought kind of going at it. There's the Western, hegemonic force that is that is traveling easterly, and then you have, this easternly force that's trying to push back against these Western democratic forces. Yeah, it kind of scares me, to be honest with you, to think about what the world would look like if Russia would have had that opportunity to kind of take advantage of a prolonged war and essentially inculcate like more arenas of war that could have been used as, boundaries for the Cold War, and kind of expanded that Soviet threat into the modern era even longer.
Yeah, and you don't even know how much, like, we saw what happened, with the Vietnam War, like, again, like China becoming communist, now backing the North Vietnamese and having a whole, like, it's a cascading effect, and it's like, creeping communism was kind of,
Yep.
maybe a word to use to describe how communism was moving into these countries. But like, again, did it all start from this one battle? Like, I don't think you can say yes, it did, but it definitely accelerated it. Like, China may have become communist anyways. North Korea may have become communist anyways. But it got to this point where this, like, just the U.S. started getting a foothold in there and using their vast resources to support these rulers, just kind of it seemed like a snowball effect, right? And I think this is where things get a little bit crazier. So one thing that I was reading up that kind of blew my mind and kind of terrified me was there was actually a plan for the Soviets to invade the northernmost island. So it's called Hokkaido, on August 24th. So this was 9 days after Japan had surrendered. So basically the Soviets decided, hey, we're going to do this. And they told Truman and the Americans, like, hey, we're going to invade in the north. And Truman was like, absolutely not. This is not what we agreed to. Japan will surrender to the US, and, we will take control of the country. You will have no part in doing this. But at this point, the relationship between the US and the Soviets is starting to sour. Truman doesn't trust Stalin. He knows that. And so I think you kind of hear the Soviets think about it a little bit. They're like, well, what if we just do it? Like, what are they going to do, right? Like, no, they're not going to, maybe they're going to get mad at us and maybe say some things, but what are they really going to do? So eventually, though, they do call it off. Part of what some people think is Stalin is still negotiating with the Allies about what happened in Eastern Europe. And he's trying to, where can he get some bargaining chips? And I think people say this might have been one of them. Like, look, I left Japan for you guys. Like, if you look at Germany, right, it was sliced up French, British, American, and Soviet. Why is Japan all American? That's maybe in Stalin's eyes, right? Like, well, where's my piece,
from
right?
His perspective, exactly. Yeah.
So he's like, where's my piece to all of this? And so it ends up getting called off, and we can kind of see why he may have done that from a political perspective. And there's also some historians argue that it probably would have never worked anyways. The Soviets were really good at land battles, and that's really what they'd perfected, across Western Russia and into Eastern Europe. And they weren't really professionals on amphibious landings. They didn't have as many landing craft as the Americans would. And Japanese air power still at the time would have been a factor on the East. So he ends up canceling the order. And around the same time, coincidentally, he kind of doubles down on nuclear weapons research. So Stalin was very public against, like, basically saying, like, look, nuclear weapons don't win wars, armies do. That was kind of a famous quote that he said. But at the same time, he's not a stupid guy. I think he understood what was going on, right? So he kind of that happens, and it kind of all comes back to, like, well, what if this battle did happen, right? Like, what if that war continued for another 6 months because the U.S. was like, hey, we don't want to drop the atomic bomb. We think it's immoral. We think it's wrong. We think the Japanese are going to surrender anyways. Could we have had a a northern Japan that's communist and a southern Japan that's democratic? Like, it may not have happened because you do have the emperor, and what he kind of said still went at the time.
You have a unified Japan, kind of.
Yeah, you do. But at the same time, we look at history of Japan, right? Very feudal, small kingdoms all over the place.
Wasn't always unified.
Yeah, and there's no reason to think that it couldn't have gone that way. So I think of all the arguments that I've seen, like, loss of life obviously is an easy one to point to because it's strict math. I think this one is almost the most, like, just jumping out to me as, like, yeah, this is the number one reason why you need to end this war today, because the Soviets and Soviet-backed communism are coming and they need to be stopped. Which kind of sounds like how people in the 50s would have talked like, oh my God, communism's coming. we need to stop them. But if we look at Soviet-backed communism and what it's done to the world, it's pretty much been a net negative everywhere it's been tried. And so like, hey, hindsight's 2020, but you
Yeah,
had to
yeah.
stop these guys. You just had to.
Well, it's funny you say like that's how people were talking in the 50s, and I'm like, well, knowing what we know now, rightfully so, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and again, it's interesting because we're here in North America having this discussion in 2022, and I always find it interesting because like we're talking after the result of the war and being directly, maybe not in a way that most people would kind of think about as a result of what would culminate, after the end of World War II. But maybe we have a Western bias, but like I totally agree with you. Like I can't think of one historical example where, where you kind of seeded, communism and it worked out well. Like I just,
Mm-hmm.
there's not any historical examples that I'm familiar with on paper
Right.
where the communist experiment, has done good things for countries and good things for people. It often has the exact opposite effect where it empowers the very few and screws over the majority.
Yeah, and I think too, just the fact that it's Soviet backed is the big thing. Because I think at the time, like Stalin being so ruthless towards even his own people, he's not going to support the nice, socialist, communist guys. Like, yeah, we're going to do things nicely. It's like he's going to support some tyrants who are very powerful and are going to give him what he wants ultimately. And so,
We're talking
yeah,
about
you can always make it.
self-induced famines, right? Like his
Yeah.
5 years plan, which maybe we can discuss in a future episode about like
Mm-hmm.
why he implemented his 5 year plans, which were ultimately successful economically speaking, but socially speaking, like millions of people died, and we don't even know because of the vast population of Russia, because
Mm-hmm.
the record keeping was really poor. So our estimates in terms of like how many people died from malnutrition or famine or hunger, it's probably like extremely underestimated how ruthless his reign actually was.
Yeah, and then you even see with Mao and his Great Leap Forward, and all of these people, kind of dying as a result of what could have happened, in those countries. And I guess you could make the argument too that, well, it's possible the Americans backed somebody and ended up being a tyrant. But I think the Soviet ideology and what Stalin kind of stood for versus like we look at what the Americans said in in their surrender terms was the Japanese will determine their own leaders, and so there was an opportunity. I'm sure that they may be being a little tongue in cheek, saying like, yeah, they're going to
Of
choose their own
course,
leaders, but
yeah,
obviously they have to be
100%. Yeah,
need to be democratic, and if a
little
communism
pro-US,
rises,
you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think I come back to that, and I think this is where Truman kind of kind of comes to a point where he very early on didn't trust Stalin, and I think Roosevelt did, which is I think is another fascinating thing because we always attribute Roosevelt as being one of the greatest presidents of all time, and I think there's another conversation to be had about Roosevelt and his relationship with Stalin, but I think we see Truman come in and right away he goes, "Oh, I do not trust this guy. He's super smart. He knows what he wants, but I do not trust him." And so I think that
Well,
again the
yeah, that's
ability
interesting.
to slow them down, I think has to go into that decision and really gives, in my eyes, gives him even more points versus like, hey, he saved a bunch of lives, but he helped kind of shape that part of the world in a positive light for the next who knows how many years, right? Like we look at China, they're gonna be communists for a lot longer, and things are moving in the wrong direction there. And Japan is you know one of the world's great countries, one of the great democracies in the world, and
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
shining light in Asia, right? I think you got to give him credit for that as well. Like ending the war quickly and slowing down whatever Stalin had planned, changed the face of the world forever.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth behind that, right? Because like to the previous point that I mentioned, in part one, he was a staunch advocate of NATO. The architect of the Marshall Plan and then the Truman Doctrine. Like these were obviously things that were on his mind at the time and immediately preceding the end of World War II. So,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination for us to kind of hypothesize that he was probably keenly aware of the Russian threat. That yeah, we're allies right now, but as soon as this ends, what's this going to look like? Because
Hmm.
we both have interests of of kind of growing our hegemony in our own regions and
Hmm.
increasing our kind of influence. That's not lost on him. It's probably not lost on Stalin either, right? Like these are leaders of the free world at this point who have been critical in ultimately fighting in and eventually putting an end to the one of the greatest global conflicts that we've ever seen.
And you even saw it too with Prime Minister Suzuki. Even when he was talking, saying like, "Hey, we're going to use the Soviets," he kind of would mention like we know the Americans and the Soviets are only teaming up here because they need to defeat Germany and they want to defeat Nazis, defeat Hitler and the Nazis. But like it's not, if it's not lost on a third party looking on, like it's definitely not lost on the leaders of those two countries. They know exactly where this is going to go, um, and it's just clear, right? Like he had to stop the Soviets. He knew that what was coming, and I think you got to give him props for that.
Yeah, well, there's nothing worse than a communist, right? Like even if it was a Nazi at first, this is an interesting thing that I think is tangentially related, but might be worthwhile to mention here. Um, I forget the name of the actual operation that it was named, but there was an operation that was, conducted on behalf of the Americans to bring Nazi scientists into America to support the American space program and nuclear programs. Because at the time, even in the midst of fighting the Nazis and putting an end to the war in the German theater, there was still this sentiment that, yeah, you know what, they were Nazis, but like they're still better than communists. So let's bring them over here to help support some of our initiatives. Like that thinking. It's so crazy to know at the same time that they're fighting this kind of theater of war in Germany, trying to bring an end to Nazism. There's still this other kind of latent sentiment that we've put into the back burner for now, which is, yeah, but like let's not forget about the communist threat, because that's the
Yeah,
one that we're going to have to worry about down the line.
it's almost like rolling between different threats. It's like we'll support Stalin because Nazis are the biggest threat right now. Oh, they've been defeated. Oh, Stalin's the biggest threat and communists are the biggest threat. So hey, Nazis are looking
Mhm.
a little bit nicer if they
Look
can
better,
help us out. And
yeah.
yeah, it's a crazy world they kind of live in, and how it's like allegiances will just shift, so quickly like that. But yeah, I come back to Truman here, and I think like he's the kind of guy, I think, like, again, we see him like having this duty to the world, and I think we've spoken about this a few times. But he definitely takes on, like, like, for a man who, like, I always come back to, like, he was not educated in a formal sense. Like he wasn't the person who went to school and studied the history of, the Russian Revolution and different things like that, and how the world's changed and how different nation states have fought. I'm it's There's a level here where he was able to learn a lot on the fly, but also, he probably had some smart advisors around him. And I think one of the things we see with leaders that is so, that makes them great, is they know how to listen from experts, and they know when to dismiss certain types of people. And you even see with Truman, dismissing Douglas MacArthur in the Korean War. Like, he was the hero of the Pacific, and then he wasn't getting the job done in Korea. And so we kind of see like Truman's a no nonsense kind of guy.
Yep.
Get the job done, or I'll find someone else who can do it. Um, yeah, so I think it kind of comes together with that legacy of his.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that this might be a good pivot point for like the lessons learned and like some of the impacts, because
Mm-hmm.
if we look at Truman and I think to what we've discussed so far and his approach to this, dropping the bombs, not trusting Stalin, wanting to curb the communist threat, it's just fascinating to me that this guy did so much in the back half of his life. Like, it is absolutely incredible. And I think, if anything, it just really, to me, showcases his adaptability and intelligence, of how he was able to kind of leverage whatever experience he got to grow and learn more, and then find himself in increasingly in positions of greater influence and greater power, to ultimately be the leader of the free world, which is like, that's crazy. Like, it's absolutely crazy. And I don't know. I don't know if there's an exact lesson learned there, other than maybe like, sometimes late blooming isn't necessarily the worst
Yeah.
thing, in his case at least.
And I
But his
wonder too, like,
impact, yeah. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
and I think you see, like, not having a non-traditional upbringing into this position, like, he wasn't a Roosevelt with the last name and brought up in this level of
Yeah.
prestige and being groomed almost for this type of life. And he was a simple man doing simple work and living a life of living on his farm, trying to open his own businesses. And I wonder if it kind of gave him a different perspective on life than someone who maybe went to you know that type of life where they were being groomed for something great in life. And it's an interesting way to think about how leaders come together and how if they have this different outlook on seeing people as remembering the time when they didn't have much or
Mhm.
different things like that, and having this level of humility that I think we saw Truman have throughout his whole life. I don't think he ever thought he deserved something or I need more of this. It was, well, this is my job to do. I've been
Almost seems
tasked
like
to
the
do this.
everyman president. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this, like that's kind of the sentiment that I'm getting from like what I was learning about him. Like this kind of like everyman, kind of position. Like, okay, thank you for the job. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to work my ass off for it, and then we'll see where it takes me. And
Hmm.
I don't think it was ultimately. It doesn't seem like the path was always very clear to him. And I think maybe that's a lesson that even if you don't want to be president, that you can take from this is that maybe your next opportunity isn't as crystal clear as you would like it to be, but you never know where you could end up. And I think Truman's kind of biography kind of indicates that, because there's nothing in his first 30 years that would ever make you think he's going to be able to get to where he is and have the legacy that he does. But he somehow manages to.
Yeah, he really does. And it's just a crazy, crazy way to live his life. And we talk about luck, right? We brought it up a bunch of times in part one, but as we kind of talked about, like, look how lucky he was that this happened and that happened. There's definitely an element of that, but I think, like, to be given so many opportunities and nail every single one of them, maybe except the vice presidency because he only had 80 days, but outside of that, I
Not much you
think
can do in 80
everything that
days,
he was,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They always say, "What's your first 100 days in office? What are you going to
Yeah.
do?" He didn't even get to that, so
Yeah.
we'll give him a pass, I guess, on
Yeah.
that one. But it's this, like, level of, okay, yeah, he was given an opportunity that was due to luck and some connections, and then he got into a position where he was able to do some good things, and he didn't get the vice president nomination because he had a buddy that was in power. He earned it. And
Yeah.
then at the same time, like, his legacy wasn't like, oh, he knew all the historians and they were the ones who kind of built his story.
Writing the books. Yeah.
He earned that legacy by doing what he did, and being drawn by duty and hard work, and being a very disciplined type of individual. So I think, yeah, I think my hat goes off to him, and I think I've got a much different kind of overview of Truman. I kind of always saw him as, hey, yeah, he did the thing with the atomic bomb, which, okay, that's an interesting decision, but he was just kind of, I always kind of saw him as the guy who replaced Roosevelt. That was really
Yeah.
the
And
extent,
I think
right?
a
And he's
lot of
definitely
people
much more
would.
than that.
I think a lot
Yeah.
of people would, and I did too. And I think even when I was doing some research and thinking about, this idea of dropping the bomb, ultimately the decision lied with him. But how much of that decision ultimately was influenced by other people, right? Like, this is not happening in a vacuum. He's got
Right.
probably, you know, dozens of people of his closest advisors telling him to do one thing or the next, right? And he ultimately decided to do it. So kudos to him, because I think it was a tough decision, one of the hardest decisions he's probably ever had to make in his career, and it went down in the history books as being one of the most impactful. That's still kind of contentious to this day, right? Like, still contentious to this day.
Yeah, I think if you still ask a lot of people, right, like, what they think about Truman, like we said, like, the guy who replaced Roosevelt. Oh
Yeah,
yeah, he made that decision with the atomic bomb. I'm not so sure that was right. The Japanese were already defeated, but yeah, I've definitely got a new perspective on him. So
yeah, me
I
too.
think maybe that's a point where we can tip our hats to President Truman for making the decision, and changing the face of the world for the better. I think is, and unfortunately it took some really horrific arithmetic to do so, but I think at the end of the day, the world is a better place because of what he did.
Yeah, and I think just like before we close, I think one of the general thoughts and impacts about this particular conversation and this particular, point in history, World War II, I think it's so easy to kind of just read it as this narrative, about something that happened before us. But, I think talking to you and, kind of getting really deep into the numbers, decision making, what's going on in Japan at the time, it makes it much more real. And I think it hopefully makes the legacy of what happened then and its impact now clear to the listeners. And I think that's ultimately a goal, right? Like, why are we talking about it? What was the implications of it, and how has it impacted us today? And it fundamentally changed the direction of the world, and has formed the world that we currently live in. And I think that's why we have these conversations. It's super important.
I think that's some wise words to end on there, Richie. I hope everybody kind of gets the same vibe, because I think the two of us can walk away from this, seeing Truman in a different light, but also understanding that whole era as not just like
Yep.
this happened. This was a very deep, complicated thing that happened and changed the world forever.
With that, I guess we'll end it off for part
I
two.
think so. All
Thanks
right.
everyone for
Thanks
listening.
everyone.
Have a great talk soon.
See you later.
Thank you so much for listening to the History in Motion podcast. We appreciate your support, and if you're a fan of what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time.